Elena brushed the dust off the old oak desk, her hands moving in practiced circles over the surface, the same routine she had done every morning for the last 3 years as Mr. Rowe's caregiver. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow over the room and the silent, aging furniture that seemed to hold secrets of its own. She enjoyed the peace of these quiet moments before Mr. Rowe woke up, a time when she could gather her thoughts and prepare herself for the day. Mr. Rowe, a man of means and mystery, had been kind to her from the beginning. He was always respectful, with a charm that came from a life lived with purpose and conviction. Yet, over time, Elena had come to realize that he was a man who kept his past locked away, only occasionally revealing snippets of a life filled with successes, regrets, and, as she could only guess, secrets. His children, Andrew and Claire, were his only family, but they were rarely around, visiting only when absolutely necessary, each visit tense with an undercurrent of impatience and indifference that Elena couldn't quite understand. As she dusted, her fingers brushed against an envelope, a small, neatly folded piece of paper, its surface faintly yellowed from age. It sat there, inconspicuous on the desk, as if waiting to be discovered. She hesitated, her curiosity battling with her respect for Mr. Rowe's privacy. But something about the placement of the note made her pause. It looked deliberately placed, not discarded. Her heart thumped as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the hastily written lines. "If something happens to me, keep my secret from my family." Her breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling from the words. She reread the sentence, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting was unmistakably Mr. Rowe's, the familiar loops and curls she had seen in his old letters and journals. But this was different. It wasn't a note she was meant to find. It was a plea, almost a warning. Keep his secret. What secret? And why from his family? Elena folded the paper carefully, her fingers trembling as she placed it back on the desk, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, to pretend she hadn't seen it, but a gnawing curiosity and a sense of responsibility held her in place. She had cared for Mr. Rowe for years, tending to his every need, helping him through his ailments, and sharing quiet conversations over tea. She couldn't ignore this. The note felt like a summons, a call to action, though she couldn't begin to guess what it meant. The silence was broken by a weak cough from the adjoining room, Mr. Rowe's signal that he was awake and ready to start his day. Elena composed herself, brushing her hands over her uniform, and walked toward his bedroom, the note still echoing in her mind. When she entered, she saw Mr. Rowe lying in bed, his skin pale, his eyes closed, as if the mere act of waking had exhausted him. His health had been declining rapidly in recent months, each day seeming to drain a little more life from him. But today, he looked especially frail, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and his eyes flickered open, a faint smile spreading across his face as he looked at her. "Elena, my dear," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I've much time left." Her heart clenched at his words, and she forced herself to maintain a calm expression. "Don't talk like that, Mr. Rowe. You've seen worse days, and you'll see many more," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. He shook his head slowly, a sadness in his gaze. "No, Elena. I can feel it. It's not just old age. It's something deeper." He paused, his eyes drifting to the door, as if ensuring they were alone. "There are things I haven't told anyone, things that must remain hidden." Elena's pulse quickened, the note's words flashing in her mind. She felt an urge to ask, to press him for answers, but she held back, waiting for him to continue. His gaze turned distant, his mind seeming to drift to a past only he could see. "Elena, you've been like family to me," he said softly, his eyes misting. "I know I don't have much, but I trust you. You're the only one I can trust." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of desperation and resignation. "Promise me. If anything happens to me, Don't let Andrew and Claire know about my affairs. They'll only bring ruin to everything I've worked for." Her mind raced, trying to process his request. She had seen Andrew and Claire's indifference, their casual neglect, but she had never suspected that Mr. Rowe's mistrust ran so deep. The weight of his words sank into her, a heavy, suffocating feeling that made her chest tighten. She wanted to refuse, to tell him that his family deserved to know the truth, whatever it was. But the look in his eyes silenced her objections, the pleading vulnerability of a man who had held secrets for far too long. "I promise," she whispered, feeling the gravity of the commitment settle on her shoulders. A look of relief washed over his face, his hand squeezing hers weakly. "Thank you, Elena. You don't know what this means to me." Moments later, Mr. Rowe's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Panic surged through her as his eyes fluttered shut, his face paling as his strength seemed to drain entirely. She grabbed her phone, dialing emergency services, her hand shaking as she relayed his symptoms. In the minutes that followed as she waited for help, her mind returned to the note and the promise she had made. A gnawing sense of dread filled her, a feeling that this was only the beginning of something far larger than she had anticipated. The ambulance arrived, and paramedics took over, their hurried voices and swift movements a stark contrast to the calm silence that had filled the room only moments before. As they rushed Mr. Rowe out, his children arrived, summoned by the hospital staff. Andrew and Claire swept in, their expressions blank, barely sparing her a glance as they followed the paramedics out to the ambulance. She felt invisible, her presence seemingly inconsequential to them. Yet, her chest held a secret, a promise that she alone carried. Hours later, in the sterile light of the hospital waiting room, Andrew and Claire sat across from her, their eyes cold and questioning. They barely acknowledged her, speaking only in curt, clipped phrases. As they talked among themselves, she felt a pang of unease, wondering how much they truly knew about their father's affairs and what they would do if they discovered the truth. Finally, Claire turned to her, her gaze sharp and probing. "You were with him before he collapsed, weren't you? Did he say anything? Anything unusual?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Elena hesitated, the weight of her promise pressing down on her. She forced herself to meet Claire's gaze, her voice steady as she replied. "He was just talking about old memories. Nothing unusual." Andrew narrowed his eyes, his expression unreadable. "Our father has been acting strange for a while. We know he's been hiding things from us. If you know anything, now would be the time to share it." A chill ran down her spine, but she kept her face calm, her voice steady. "I'm only his caregiver. I don't know anything about his private matters." The words felt hollow, a flimsy defense against their scrutiny, but they seemed to accept her answer, at least for now. As they turned away, discussing matters in hushed voices, Elena realized the full weight of what she had committed to. Her simple promise had become a barrier between Mr. Rowe's secrets and his children's insatiable curiosity, a shield that she wasn't sure she could hold up forever. As she sat in the waiting room, watching the minutes crawl by, she wondered what Mr. Rowe had meant, what secrets lay hidden in his past, and why he had chosen her, a mere caregiver, to guard them. Hours passed in the hospital waiting room, each minute stretching longer than the last. The sterile, artificial light made everything feel cold and distant, casting an unsettling glow over the white walls and worn-out chairs. Elena sat silently, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The note, Mr. Rowe's whispered words, his children's harsh stares, all these pieces whirled in her mind, forming a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. She felt like an outsider in this strange world of privilege and mystery, yet bound to it by an invisible thread, one made of loyalty, duty, and an undeniable curiosity. Finally, a doctor emerged from behind the doors, his expression unreadable as he approached Andrew and Claire. Elena sat a few seats away, unnoticed by the siblings, listening as he explained their father's condition in calm, clinical terms. Mr. Rowe had survived, but he was still fragile, hanging by a thread that could snap at any moment. He'd been moved to the intensive care unit, and his condition was touch and go. Andrew and Claire seemed almost indifferent, exchanging a brief detached glance. It struck Elena as odd, this lack of emotion. Even with the tension and unresolved issues between them, she would have expected some sign of concern. But they barely reacted, their faces blank as they listened to the doctor's instructions about visiting hours and restrictions. When the doctor left, Andrew let out an exasperated sigh, almost as if he were inconvenienced rather than worried. Claire fished her phone from her purse and began scrolling, her fingers moving briskly over the screen. They didn't talk, didn't even look at each other, each lost in their own world. Elena felt a pang of something, anger, maybe even pity, watching them. As she sat there, an uncomfortable silence settled around them, broken only by the distant beeps and murmurs of the hospital corridor. The silence was thick with unspoken words and hidden resentment. Elena's thoughts drifted back to Mr. Rowe's whispered request, his plea to keep his secrets hidden. She knew there was more to this story, more than the cold, detached expressions of his children could explain. She remembered fragments of conversations she'd overheard, remarks Mr. Rowe had made over the years, always vague, hinting at some buried conflict. His children's actions today only deepened her suspicion. Lost in thought, Elena barely noticed the shadow that loomed over her until a familiar voice snapped her back to reality. "Elena," came the smooth, practiced voice of Mr. Benson, Mr. Rowe's lawyer, who seemed to appear out of nowhere. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and a sharp, calculating gaze that missed nothing. Mr. Benson was known in town as a man of integrity, but also as someone who knew how to navigate the murky waters of family wealth and legacy. His presence, unannounced, added a layer of intrigue that Elena couldn't ignore. "Elena, may we speak privately?" Mr. Benson asked, his tone polite but firm, leaving little room for refusal. She nodded, following him down the corridor and into a small consultation room. The walls were bare except for a single clock, its second hand ticking loudly, amplifying the quiet tension between them. Mr. Benson closed the door, turning to face her with a look of cautious curiosity. "I trust Mr. Rowe mentioned certain matters to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Mr. Rowe's request had been directed to her alone, a private moment she wasn't sure she wanted to share, especially not with someone as shrewd as Mr. Benson. But something in his eyes told her that he already knew more than he was letting on. "Mr. Rowe asked me to keep his affairs private," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. He didn't want his family to know about certain things." Mr. Benson nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Yes, that would be consistent with Mr. Rowe's wishes," he replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was a man who valued his privacy, even when it came to his own children. Elena felt a surge of frustration. Why Mr. Benson? Why was he so determined to keep things from his family? Surely they have a right to know. Mr. Benson's gaze softened, his sharp demeanor giving way to a flicker of sympathy. Mr. Rowe's relationship with his children was complicated. Andrew and Claire grew up with every privilege, but over time, they developed a sense of entitlement that Mr. Rowe found deeply troubling. He often worried that they were more interested in his wealth than in him as a person. Elena nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her. So, he kept things hidden, to protect them from themselves. "Perhaps," Mr. Benson replied, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "Or perhaps he kept things hidden to protect himself. There are some things money can't buy, Elena. Loyalty, trust, respect." Mr. Rowe knew that his fortune had become a curse, something that drove a wedge between him and his children. In the end, he trusted you, a simple caregiver, more than his own blood. Elena felt a pang of guilt, mixed with a strange sense of honor. She had been chosen to guard this man's secrets, entrusted with a responsibility that went beyond mere caregiving. But the weight of that responsibility felt almost unbearable. She didn't know how long she could keep this up, how long she could stand between Mr. Rowe's wishes and the relentless curiosity of his children. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Benson leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Elena, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. Mr. Rowe made provisions in his will, provisions that will likely come as a shock to his children. But he made it very clear that he wanted certain matters to remain private. If you reveal anything prematurely, it could have serious consequences." Elena's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. Consequences. She hadn't thought about that. She had only been thinking about her loyalty to Mr. Rowe, her promise to keep his secrets. But now she realized that this promise might have repercussions she hadn't anticipated. Before she could respond, the door opened and Claire appeared, her face tight with anger. "What's going on in here?" she demanded, her gaze flickering suspiciously between Elena and Mr. Benson. "Why are you two talking in private?" Mr. Benson remained calm, his expression unruffled. "Miss Rowe, I was merely explaining some of your father's wishes to Elena. As his caregiver, she has certain responsibilities that require her discretion." Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. "Discretion? She's a caregiver, not his confidant. I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't stand for it. My father's affairs are family matters, and I have every right to know what's going on." Mr. Benson's eyes narrowed, his tone icy. "Your father trusted Elena, Miss Rowe. I suggest you respect his wishes." Claire's face flushed, but she held her ground, glaring at Elena with a mixture of resentment and suspicion. "Fine, but I'll be watching. Don't think for a second that I'm going to let this secrecy continue." She turned on her heel, stalking out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door closed, Mr. Benson sighed, rubbing his temples as if exhausted by the encounter. "You see what I mean, Elena. This is why Mr. Rowe trusted you. His children, they don't understand the concept of loyalty. They only see what they want, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Elena nodded, feeling a new resolve harden within her. She had made a promise to Mr. Rowe, and she would honor it, no matter how difficult it became. But even as she made this silent vow, a nagging doubt crept into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than Mr. Benson had revealed, more than Mr. Rowe had confided. And as she looked at Mr. Benson's guarded expression, she wondered if even he was hiding something. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with Elena moving between Mr. Rowe's room and the waiting area, avoiding Andrew and Claire as best she could. The siblings were persistent, cornering her whenever they had a chance, peppering her with questions about their father's health, his finances, his plans. She answered as best she could, sticking to the basics, deflecting their more intrusive questions with practiced patience. But the tension was building, like a storm gathering on the horizon, and Elena knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Mr. Rowe's secrets were no longer safely hidden. They were teetering on the edge, waiting to be exposed. And she was caught in the middle, a reluctant guardian of truths she barely understood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital corridors, Elena sat by Mr. Rowe's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She thought of the note, the promise, the quiet desperation in his voice when he had asked her to protect his secrets. She thought of his children, circling like vultures, waiting to claim their share of his legacy. And she thought of Mr. Benson, the only person who seemed to understand the true weight of the responsibility she carried. In that moment, Elena made a decision. She would honor Mr. Rowe. The next morning arrived with a heavy sense of foreboding, thick as the mist that clung to the city streets outside the hospital. Elena's sleepless night had been filled with haunting questions and the echo of Mr. Rowe's whispered request. She had made her promise, but with each passing moment, she felt the weight of it growing heavier, as if it were a boulder lodged in her chest. The hospital halls were quiet and dim, yet even here she could feel the pulsing undercurrent of tension from Mr. Rowe's family. His children had arrived early, their eyes scanning every passing nurse and doctor with a guarded wariness that mirrored their suspicions. Alina barely had a moment to catch her breath before Andrew approached her, his face hard and eyes piercing. His voice was low, sharp enough to make her stiffen. "Caregiver, I need a word with you. Now." Reluctantly, she followed him into a small waiting area, glancing nervously at the tightly drawn blinds and the closed door. Andrew's jaw was set, and his voice carried an edge that sent a chill down her spine. "Listen," he began, folding his arms across his chest. "I know my father's been hiding things. It's obvious he's not as weak and helpless as you'd like us to believe." "I don't know what you mean," she replied, keeping her tone as steady as possible, though her hands trembled slightly behind her back. "Don't play innocent," he sneered. "I saw the way he looked at you before he collapsed, whispering secrets you're keeping from us. And let's be honest, if you weren't hiding something, you'd have no reason to be so cagey." He leaned in, his face mere inches from hers. "I want to know what he told you." Alina's mind raced. She knew Andrew's game. He was trying to intimidate her, to shake her resolve. But she held her ground, remembering Mr. Rowe's pleading eyes and the fragile, vulnerable tone he'd used. She couldn't betray that trust. Not now. "I'm only here to take care of your father's medical needs," she said firmly. "Whatever else you think is going on is none of my business." Andrew's mouth twisted into a smirk, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Fine. Play the loyal servant all you want, but we both know you're hiding something." With that, he turned on his heel, leaving her alone in the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alina felt a wave of relief as he left, but it was short-lived. Just minutes later, Claire appeared, her face pale and eyes filled with a strange intensity. She approached Alina with an air of forced calm, though her voice trembled slightly. "Miss Alina," she began, her voice soft yet strained. "I'm not like my brother. I don't want to pry into things that don't concern me. But I am concerned about my father. He's always been secretive, but recently he seemed almost paranoid." She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "I just want to know if he's okay. If he's said anything to you." Alina's heart softened slightly. Claire seemed genuine, her worry less self-centered than her brother's. But even so, Alina couldn't let herself be swayed. She chose her words carefully, aware that any hint of the truth could unravel everything. "Your father cares for you very much," she replied gently. "He's just going through something personal, but I can assure you he's in good hands here." Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, offering Alina a faint, sad smile before walking away, her shoulders slumped. The encounter left Alina feeling conflicted. She could see the pain in Claire's eyes, the genuine concern beneath the surface. But Mr. Rowe's words echoed in her mind, and she knew she couldn't betray his trust, no matter how difficult it was to see his family hurting. She had only a moment's respite before the door to Mr. Rowe's room opened, and Mr. Benson stepped out, his face a mask of calm professionalism. He gestured for her to join him, his eyes holding a quiet urgency that made her pulse quicken. "Alina," he began in a hushed tone, closing the door behind them. "Mr. Rowe's condition is worsening. I fear he may not have much time left." He paused, studying her carefully. "He's asked to see you, alone." Her heart raced. She nodded, swallowing hard as she stepped into the dimly lit room. Mr. Rowe lay motionless on a hospital bed, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. His eyes flickered open as she approached, and he offered her a weak smile. "Alina," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for keeping my secret." She took his hand, feeling the frailty of his fingers, the weight of his trust pressing on her chest. "Of course, Mr. Rowe. But what is it you want me to do? I don't understand why I have to keep this from your family. Shouldn't they know?" He shook his head weakly, a shadow of fear crossing his face. "They wouldn't understand. They'd only twist it," turn it into something ugly. He took a shuddering breath, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for invisible threats. There are things I've done in my life that I can't undo. Choices I made. And people I hurt. His voice broke, and a single tear slid down his cheek. But this is something I have to protect, even from them. A chill ran down Alina's spine as he continued, his voice barely a whisper. Years ago, I made a decision that changed everything. I've kept it hidden, locked away. But now I don't have the strength to carry it alone. I need you, Alina. I need you to guard it, to keep it safe. Please, promise me. Alina felt a lump in her throat, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know what he was asking, but she could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that gnawed at him. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. I promise. His face softened, a look of relief washing over him. He squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes drifting closed as he murmured, Thank you, Alina. You don't know what this means to me. She stayed by his side, holding his hand, feeling the fragile beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, and she could feel the weight of his secrets pressing down on her, a burden she hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. Finally, his breathing evened out, and he drifted into a restless sleep, his face etched with lines of regret and pain. As she left the room, Mr. Benson was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression grave. He motioned for her to follow him down a quiet corridor, away from prying eyes and ears. Alina, he said quietly, his gaze intense. Mr. Rowe's affairs, they're more complicated than you realize. He entrusted you with something because he knew you'd protect it. But that doesn't mean others won't come looking. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, a flicker of unease in his eyes. There are people, powerful people, who have been watching Mr. Rowe for a long time. They're interested in his assets, his connections. If they find out about his decision, they'll stop at nothing to take it. Alina's heart pounded, a sense of dread filling her. She had thought she was protecting a simple family secret, a matter of loyalty between a caregiver and her employer. But now she realized there was something much darker lurking beneath the surface, a secret that had the power to unravel everything. Mr. Benson looked at her, his face somber. I'll do my best to protect you, Alina, but you need to be careful. Andrew and Claire may not be the only ones you have to worry about. Alina felt a chill run down her spine. She had been thrust into a world she barely understood, a world of wealth, power, and hidden dangers. And now, with Mr. Rowe's life hanging in the balance, she was the only one standing between his legacy and the forces that sought to claim it. As she returned to the waiting area, she saw Andrew and Claire watching her, their eyes filled with suspicion. They knew she was hiding something, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they uncovered it. The tension had become almost unbearable. Alina could feel it seeping into every fiber of her being, weighing on her like a cloak she couldn't shed. As the hours passed, she moved through the hospital halls like a ghost, trying to keep out of sight. Andrew and Claire's eyes followed her every move, their unspoken accusations hanging in the air, thick and oppressive. They were relentless, their suspicions growing sharper with each passing minute, and Alina could feel the noose tightening. She kept her distance from them as best as she could, focusing on her duties and on Mr. Rowe, who had slipped into a deep and fevered sleep, his face gaunt and pale, like a man haunted by his own secrets. She barely had a moment to herself when Mr. Benson appeared beside her once again, his expression as unreadable as ever. His presence, though reassuring, also reminded her of the complexity of the situation. Mr. Benson was a man of secrets himself, a lawyer who had seen the best and worst of the world, yet something in his demeanor made her wonder how deeply he was involved in all of this. He gestured for her to follow him into a quiet corner, away from prying eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina, he began, a note of urgency in his tone. I have some troubling news. The situation with Mr. Rowe's affairs is evolving. I have reason to believe that certain individuals, outside of his family, are aware of his condition and may try to intervene. Intervene? How? She asked, her heart pounding. There are assets tied to Mr. Rowe's name that are highly valuable. Properties, investments, even a few companies with government contracts. Mr. Benson explained, his eyes dark with concern. I've managed to keep them off the radar for now, but if the wrong people get wind of his weakened state, they'll make a move. They know Mr. Rowe kept everything under tight control, and they also know he trusted you. The realization hit Elena like a slap. She wasn't just guarding Mr. Rowe's wishes. She was now a player in a game she hadn't signed up for, one that extended far beyond the family feud between Andrew and Claire. She was a key piece in protecting assets and secrets that could attract powerful, potentially dangerous interests. What do I need to do? She whispered, barely able to keep the fear from her voice. Mr. Benson's face softened, a hint of sympathy flashing in his eyes. For now, keep doing what you're doing. Don't give the family any reason to suspect you know more than you're letting on. I'll handle the legal side of things, but I need you to be my eyes and ears around Mr. Rowe's family. Keep me informed if anything changes. Elena nodded, her mind racing. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. Just as Mr. Benson finished speaking, a low, familiar voice echoed down the hall. She turned to see Andrew approaching, his face twisted in barely concealed frustration. "What are you two talking about?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "Just going over some of your father's healthcare instructions," Mr. Benson replied smoothly, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Elena has been very helpful in making sure your father's needs are met." Andrew's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his face. "I find it strange, Benson, that you're spending so much time with the caregiver rather than with us, his family." Mr. Benson raised an eyebrow, his expression unbothered. "Your father entrusted me to act in his best interest. I intend to honor that." With a scoff, Andrew turned his glare back to Elena, his eyes dark and unyielding. "I don't trust you," he said bluntly. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'll get to the bottom of it. My father may be too weak to see through you, but I'm not." The accusation stung, but Elena held her ground, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm only here to help your father, Mr. Rowe. Nothing more, nothing less." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff, until Andrew finally turned away, muttering under his breath. As he disappeared down the hall, Mr. Benson let out a sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "He's not going to let this go, you know," Mr. Benson murmured. "The Rowe siblings are relentless when it comes to their father's assets, and with the vultures circling, we're running out of time." Elena felt a surge of fear, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the task at hand. She had made a promise, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Later that evening, she returned to Mr. Rowe's room, finding him awake but weak, his breathing shallow. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, had dulled with exhaustion, and yet there was a flicker of recognition when he saw her. He gestured weakly for her to come closer, and she leaned in, her heart pounding as he struggled to speak. "Elena," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. There's a safe in my study, hidden behind the bookshelf. The code is—" He stopped, coughing violently, his face contorted with pain. Elena placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, waiting as he caught his breath. "Please, Mr. Rowe, don't push yourself," she whispered, but he shook his head, his gaze intense. "No, you must know. The code is 722124, he managed, his voice fading. "Inside, you'll find documents, important ones. I need you to protect them." Her mind reeled. She had never expected to be entrusted with something like this, a safe, hidden documents. The implications of what he was asking sank in slowly, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. "I'll protect them, Mr. Rowe. I promise." A faint smile crossed his lips, and he closed his eyes, his breathing evening out as he drifted back into sleep. As she left his room, her heart heavy with the burden of her new duty, she could feel the eyes of the Rowe family following her every move. They knew something was happening, something beyond their control, and Elena could sense their growing desperation. The next day, she took a risk, slipping away from the hospital under the pretense of gathering some of Mr. Rowe's personal effects. She made her way to his grand estate, an imposing mansion that loomed at the edge of town, hidden behind high iron gates and ancient trees. The air was thick with anticipation as she entered the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She made her way to Mr. Rowe's study, her heart pounding as she approached the massive bookshelf he had described. The rows of books seemed endless, filled with titles she'd never heard of, each one meticulously arranged. Taking a deep breath, she searched the shelf, her fingers brushing over the spines until she found the latch, a small, nearly invisible lever hidden behind a row of dusty novels. The shelf swung open, revealing a hidden compartment with a small steel safe nestled within. She punched in the code -72214, her fingers trembling as the lock clicked open. Inside, she found a stack of documents, neatly arranged, their contents obscured by official seals and signatures. But one document, lying on top, caught her attention. It was a letter written in Mr. Rowe's unmistakable handwriting, addressed to her. "Elena," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I've placed my trust in you one last time. These documents contain information that could change everything for my family, and for others who have relied on me. But there are those who would use this information to bring harm. You are my guardian now, my final line of defense. Keep these safe. Do not trust anyone, not even those closest to me. And remember, loyalty is sometimes the most dangerous gift." Her hand shook as she finished reading, her mind racing with questions. What exactly was she guarding? And who were these people Mr. Rowe feared so much that he'd trust her, a caregiver, over his own children? The questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was clear. She couldn't let anyone, especially Andrew and Claire, know what she'd found. Carefully, she placed the documents back in the safe, locking it with the same code. She returned the bookshelf to its original position, covering any trace of her presence. As she left the mansion, her heart pounded with the realization of the danger she was now in, her mind racing with the weight of what she had discovered. By the time she returned to the hospital, she could feel the tension radiating from Andrew and Claire. They must have noticed her absence, and their suspicious glares only confirmed her fears. But she kept her expression calm, her gaze steady as she returned to Mr. Rowe's side, his weak smile a reminder of the trust he had placed in her. In that moment, she knew that her life would never be the same. The secrets she now held could ruin powerful people, destroy families, and end lives. And she was the only one standing between Mr. Rowe's legacy and those who would do anything to claim it. As the days passed, Elena became acutely aware of the walls closing in around her. Every step she took felt like it was being watched, every glance from Andrew and Claire loaded with suspicion. Even the staff at the hospital, who once greeted her with warmth, now seemed distant, their eyes flickering with questions they wouldn't dare ask. Mr. Rowe's condition remained perilous, teetering between life and death, and with each passing hour, Elena could feel the pressure mounting, her role shifting from caregiver to guardian of his final wishes. One evening, after checking on Mr. Rowe's vitals and ensuring he was comfortable, she decided to take a few minutes to clear her head. She stepped outside the hospital, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling tension inside. The parking lot was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. But her moment of peace was abruptly shattered by a voice behind her. "You're a hard woman to find, Miss Elena." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the shadows was a tall, sharply dressed man with an unsettlingly calm demeanor. He looked out of place against the bland backdrop of the hospital, his suit tailored, his shoes polished, his gaze intense and unwavering. She recognized him from whispers around the estate. He was known only as Mr. Kessler, a powerful figure with ties to Mr. Rowe's business dealings, someone who operated in the shadows, dealing with matters that were best left unspoken. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Mr. Kessler smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "It's not about what I want, Miss Elena. It's about what you're holding. I believe Mr. Rowe has entrusted you with certain sensitive materials that are of great interest to a few powerful parties." Elena's pulse quickened. She knew then that her worst fears were coming true. The secret she held, the documents hidden behind the bookshelf, these weren't just family matters. They were something much larger, something dangerous. She didn't respond, meeting his gaze with a determined silence. Mr. Kessler's smile faded. "Listen, Elena, I can assure you that I'm not the enemy. I only wish to keep things orderly. But those documents, they belong in the right hands. If you cooperate, I can ensure that this situation resolves peacefully." The weight of her promise to Mr. Rowe pressed heavily on her. She could still hear his voice, the way he'd entrusted her with those final instructions, his plea for her to protect his legacy. She knew that handing over the documents would betray everything he'd fought to protect, everything he'd kept hidden. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kessler," she said quietly, "but whatever it is you're looking for, I can't help you." His eyes hardened, a flicker of frustration flashing across his face. "Miss Elena, I urge you to reconsider. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. You're protecting a man's dying wish, yes, but at what cost? This isn't just about loyalty. It's about survival. And I don't think you're prepared for the consequences." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the parking lot. Mr. Kessler's gaze flicked toward the entrance, his expression cooling as he stepped back into the shadows. "We'll talk again soon, Miss Elena," he murmured, disappearing into the darkness just as Andrew appeared around the corner, his face twisted in a scowl. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Elena forced herself to remain calm, brushing off the encounter with Mr. Kessler as if it were nothing. "Just getting some fresh air," she replied, meeting his glare with a calm expression. Andrew narrowed his eyes. "You've been acting strange ever since my father got sick. Don't think I haven't noticed. You're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Without another word, he turned and stalked back into the hospital, leaving her alone in the parking lot, her mind racing with 1,000 questions and fears. She knew now that she was trapped in a game with stakes far higher than she'd ever imagined. Her loyalty to Mr. Rowe had drawn her into a web of secrets, one that was quickly unraveling, and she was caught in the middle of it. The following morning, as she entered Mr. Rowe's room, she found Mr. Benson waiting for her, his expression somber. He closed the door quietly behind her, his voice low and urgent. "Elena, we have a problem," he said, his eyes dark with worry. "Mr. Rowe's condition is deteriorating, and we may not have much time left. He's instructed me to prepare certain arrangements, but there's been interference." "What do you mean?" she asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Mr. Benson hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There are certain parties, individuals with significant influence, who have been watching Mr. Rowe's estate for years. They believe they have a claim to his assets, and they're willing to go to any lengths to secure them. Kessler is one of them, but he's not alone. And now they know you're involved." Elena's heart pounded. She had always sensed that Mr. Rowe's wealth and influence made him a target, but she hadn't realized the extent of the threat. She thought back to Mr. Kessler's warning in the parking lot, the way he'd spoken of forces beyond her understanding. The danger felt closer than ever, pressing in from all sides. "What do I do?" she whispered, feeling a rare moment of vulnerability. Mr. Benson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done more than anyone could have asked, Elena. But now it's time to take the final steps. The documents Mr. Rowe entrusted to you, those are the key. They contain information about his business dealings, yes, but more importantly, they reveal the full extent of his estate and the hidden trust he created. The trust is meant to protect those assets from his children and others who might abuse them. Elena nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words. She understood now why Mr. Rowe had kept these secrets, why he had entrusted her with such a heavy responsibility. He had been trying to protect something beyond himself, something that would endure, something that would outlast even his own family's greed. But before she could respond, the door to the room swung open, and Claire stormed in, her face red with anger. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice loud and furious. "I've had enough of this secrecy. My father is dying, and I won't be shut out any longer. We deserve to know what's happening." Mr. Benson's expression darkened, but he maintained his composure. "Claire, this isn't the time. Your father's affairs are his own, and he made his wishes clear." "His wishes?" She spat, her eyes narrowing. "You mean he trusted this woman more than his own children? She's a stranger, a servant, yet you act like she's part of the family. I won't stand for it." Elena felt a surge of anger, but she held her tongue, knowing that any response would only fuel Claire's suspicions. But then, as if in response to the tension, a weak voice spoke from the bed. "Enough." All three of them turned, surprised to see Mr. Rowe awake, his gaze focused and sharp despite his frail condition. His voice was weak but steady, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Claire," he continued, his tone firm, "you and Andrew have taken enough from me over the years. I trusted Elena because she's loyal, because she understands that my legacy is more than just money. You and your brother, you see only what you can take." Claire's face twisted in fury, her hands clenched into fists. "Father, how can you say that? We're your children. Everything you have should be ours. It's our right." Mr. Rowe's gaze softened, a hint of sadness flickering in his eyes. "That's where you're wrong. Legacy isn't about inheritance. It's about values, principles, things you two have never cared to understand. Elena is more family to me than you and Andrew ever were." Claire's face flushed with humiliation and rage, but before she could respond, Mr. Benson stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Rowe has made his decision, and it is legally binding. His estate will be managed according to his wishes, with Elena's assistance." The realization hit Claire like a blow, and she stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. A heavy silence settled over the room, and Elena felt a mixture of relief and sorrow as she looked down at Mr. Rowe, who was watching her with a tired but grateful expression. "Thank you, Elena," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "You've done more for me than anyone could have asked." She smiled, feeling the weight of her promise easing, if only slightly. She knew that the battle wasn't over, that Andrew and Claire, along with people like Kessler, would continue to circle, seeking any opportunity to undermine Mr. Rowe's wishes. But for now, she had done her part, honoring the trust he had placed in her, standing guard over the legacy he had fought so hard in the days that followed. Mr. Rowe's health took a steady decline. The doctors told Elena that it was only a matter of time, but she refused to let go of the promise she'd made to him. Even as his breaths grew weaker, she remained by his side, vigilant against the forces that threatened to unravel everything he had worked to protect. She felt the weight of his legacy pressing on her shoulders, the burden of secrets she still didn't fully understand. Andrew and Claire continued their relentless watch, hoping for any slip that would reveal the location of the hidden documents or some loophole to reclaim control of their father's estate. And then, one quiet morning, the inevitable happened. Mr. Rowe passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving Elena alone with a promise that felt both sacred and impossible. In the wake of his death, the estate fell into chaos. The reading of Mr. Rowe's will drew the attention of not just Andrew and Claire, but also influential figures from around the city, business partners, competitors, and even officials from high places. They all came, hoping to claim some piece of his fortune, or at least to witness the distribution of assets rumored to be enormous and hidden in layers of trusts and shell companies. Alina, dressed in black and blending in among the mourners, kept to herself, listening from the back of the room as Mr. Benson took the podium to address the crowd. "Thank you all for coming today to honor the life and legacy of Mr. Theodore Rowe," Mr. Benson began, his voice solemn but commanding. "Mr. Rowe's will is straightforward in some respects, but complex in others, and I ask that you all remain patient as we address his final wishes." Andrew and Claire sat at the front, their expressions tense, jaws clenched as they anticipated what was to come. They had been denied access to their father's finances for years, forced to live on modest stipends, while Mr. Rowe guarded his wealth with iron will. Now, they expected it all to come flooding into their hands, but Alina knew otherwise, as did Mr. Benson. With measured words, Mr. Benson began reading from the will, outlining Mr. Rowe's bequests. He started with the small allocations, donations to various charities and organizations that Mr. Rowe had supported. There were bequests to longtime friends, caretakers, and staff, all in line with Mr. Rowe's wishes to provide for those who had shown loyalty and respect. But as he reached the heart of the document, the room grew silent, every eye trained on him as he paused, shifting the papers with deliberate slowness. Finally, Mr. Benson continued, "We come to the primary estate and holdings of Mr. Theodore Rowe. After years of contemplation and reflection, Mr. Rowe has chosen to leave the majority of his wealth and assets to a trust established in his name. This trust will be managed by a foundation dedicated to community development, youth education, and social welfare. Mr. Rowe believed that his legacy should serve the community and reflect values of integrity, fairness, and opportunity." The air in the room turned electric. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, and Alina watched as shock spread across Andrew and Claire's faces. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to anger as they realized what had just happened. The vast wealth they had assumed was theirs had been channeled into a foundation that would provide for others, rendering their inheritance a mere fraction of what they had expected. "What?" Andrew shouted, leaping to his feet. "This has to be some kind of mistake. My father would never. This isn't his wish." Mr. Benson remained unperturbed, his gaze steely. "This is precisely Mr. Rowe's wish. He specified it clearly, and I have documentation to prove it. Furthermore, the executor of this trust will oversee its operations independently, ensuring that these funds are used strictly for their intended purposes." "Who's the executor?" Claire demanded, her face flushed with rage. "Who could possibly have the right to control my father's legacy?" Mr. Benson's gaze shifted to Alina, who felt every eye in the room turned toward her. He cleared his throat, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Mr. Rowe selected Alina Morales to serve as the executor of his foundation, trusting her to fulfill his vision. A stunned silence fell over the room. Alina's heart raced, her hand shaking as she tried to process what she had just heard. She had known that Mr. Rowe had trusted her, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She looked at Mr. Benson, who gave her a nod of encouragement, his eyes conveying a message of unwavering confidence. Andrew's voice broke the silence, trembling with fury. "This is absurd. She's a nobody, a caretaker. This can't be legally binding." "It is," Mr. Benson replied firmly. "Mr. Rowe made his wishes clear, and I assure you, this will is airtight. Alina has full authority over the foundation and its assets. Any attempt to contest this would be fruitless." The atmosphere grew tense as Andrew and Claire exchanged furious glances, their disbelief giving way to seething anger. Alina could feel their resentment piercing through her, and for the first time, she realized the full scope of her responsibility. She was no longer just Mr. Rowe's caregiver. She was the steward of his legacy, a legacy he had chosen to share with the world rather than his own children. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal procedures, media attention, and scrutiny. News of the will's contents spread quickly, and the story of a humble caregiver entrusted with the fortune of a wealthy man, captivated the public. Reporters camped outside the estate, clamoring for interviews, while powerful figures tried to sway Elena into favoring their interests. Even Mr. Kessler reappeared, his tone smoother yet more menacing, subtly pressuring her to consider alternative options for the foundation's funds. But she held firm, remembering Mr. Rowe's words and the promise she had made. Amid the chaos, Andrew and Claire continued their fight, challenging the will in court, launching smear campaigns to discredit Elena, and even accusing her of manipulating their father in his final days. The strain was overwhelming. But Elena found strength in the support of Mr. Benson and in the memory of Mr. Rowe's quiet confidence in her. One evening, as she sat in Mr. Rowe's study, going over the foundation's paperwork, she found herself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. She was an ordinary woman who had lived a simple life, yet she had been chosen to carry out a vision that reached beyond her own understanding. The foundation, she realized, was more than just an organization. It was Mr. Rowe's attempt to atone for past mistakes, to make a difference in ways he hadn't managed during his lifetime. She felt a surge of purpose, a determination to honor his legacy by ensuring that the foundation fulfilled its mission. Months passed, and slowly the furor surrounding Mr. Rowe's estate began to subside. Andrew and Claire's legal challenges were dismissed, their influence waning as the foundation gained traction. Elena threw herself into her work, channeling her energy into projects that would benefit the community: scholarships for underprivileged youth, housing for the homeless, and mentorship programs for at-risk teens. She saw firsthand the impact of Mr. Rowe's legacy, the lives that were being changed, and it filled her with a sense of fulfillment she had never known. But her journey was far from over. One night, as she sat alone in the study, she noticed a small envelope tucked into the pages of one of Mr. Rowe's old journals. Curious, she opened it, revealing a handwritten letter addressed to her. "Elena," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've made it through the storm. I knew you would. You have a strength that goes beyond loyalty, a courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. I have no doubt that you'll protect my legacy with the same devotion you showed me. Remember, the foundation isn't just about my name or my wealth. It's about creating a better future, one where people like you have the chance to make a difference. Thank you, Elena, for everything. Theodore." Tears filled her eyes as she read his words, a bittersweet ache filling her heart. In that moment, she knew that she had found her purpose, not just as a caretaker, but as a guardian of hope, of change. She would carry forward Mr. Rowe's vision, building something lasting, something that would outlive even the whispers of scandal and greed. As the foundation grew, Elena became known in the community as a quiet, resilient leader, a woman who had turned an extraordinary trust into a force for good. The city changed because of her work, and people saw the fruits of Mr. Rowe's legacy in their schools, their neighborhoods, and their lives. And every time she looked at the letter, tucked safely in her desk drawer, she was reminded of the man who had believed in her, the man who had given her a mission larger than herself. In the end, the community remembered Theodore Rowe, not as a wealthy man or a mysterious figure, but as a visionary whose legacy had transformed lives. And they remembered Elena as the woman who had carried that vision forward, turning her promise into a new beginning for countless others.